I'm just checking with everyone to see how the sound is. If you can't hear, please let me know by typing in the chat box. All right, we are offering 2.0 professional development hours, and you will be able to access your certificate in the Stormwater manual on the webinars page. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Mike Trojan.
Good afternoon, everybody. We're a little flustered here with the sound, but I think we're ready to go finally. So today I'm just going to give a real brief overview of phosphorus impairments and then turn it over to our three speakers. But the focus is going to be on understanding how 3 BMPs that are commonly used have maybe not worked quite as effectively as we had hoped or liked them to work. And those 3 are constructed wet ponds, biofiltration or bioretention systems that have an underdrain, and then street sweeping and tree litter management, which is kind of a broad category, but covers a lot of topics. So just real briefly, most of you probably already know this, but we care a lot about phosphorus. We love our lakes here and streams in Minnesota and elsewhere and around the country. Unfortunately, phosphorus is a driver of impairments in many of our lakes and streams. It's the primary driver of algal growth, attached periphyton. It limits recreational opportunities. When it gets bad enough, it can lead to blue-green algae production that results in toxic algal blooms. And they're often associated with swings in oxygen concentrations that can result in fish kills. In Minnesota here, we assess our lakes using the criteria shown on this table here. You can see that the concentrations that would trigger an impairment vary statewide from the northern part of Minnesota, where you can have concentrations as low as 12 parts per billion that would lead to an impairment to up to 90 parts per billion in the southern part of the state, for example. We need a minimum of 8 samples collected over 2 years, and we're looking at near surface data here for this. And by the way, I need to thank our assessment folks here at the agency and Pam Anderson for providing this information. So to get on our impairment list, you need to exceed the phosphorus limit as well as either the SEC-E disc or the chlorophyll A value. For rivers, it's similar but a little bit different. The numbers are a little bit different. We haven't been assessing streams and rivers quite as long as lakes. You need a minimum of 12 samples during the summer period. And again, you need to exceed phosphorus in one of these other criteria that are out there. In Minnesota, it doesn't show up real well here, but we have 596 impairments as of 2016 with another 50 ready to go in 2018. So we have over 600 lakes in Minnesota that are considered to be impaired for eutrophication. So it is a widespread concern. Streams, even though we haven't been assessing them for quite as long, we're still looking at 42 impairments with an additional 6 here in 2018. So again, it is a statewide issue here. So in the stormwater world, we address this through best management practices, and we have 3 practices that we think can be very effective in reducing phosphorus concentrations. The management of vegetative litter, biofiltration, and wet ponds. But unfortunately, these practices have not always been as effective as we would like. And that's why we've invited our 3 speakers in, and at this point I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker. We're going to allow each speaker to introduce themselves. And so our first speaker here to talk about constructed wet ponds is Joe Bischoff. And I have to check here real quick, and I need to do a screen switch here at this point. So I got to do a quick screen switch here to get Joe's talk up here. So bear with me for just a second. And then I'll just switch you next one.
So you put it in slideshow. Perfect, great. Thanks for having me. Thanks for tuning in. My name's Joe Bischoff. I'm a limnologist with Wank Associates in the Twin Cities metro area. I work a lot on TMDLs, water quality issues, And I work with a lot of municipalities trying to manage stormwater for phosphorus control. So really what I'd like to talk about today is some of the limitations that we found of using stormwater ponds for phosphorus control, how we might be able to overcome those, and how we really need to start including some of these other issues into our assessment approach. I have to start by thanking a lot of my partners. This is from working with a number of different clients throughout the metro area, working with the University of Wisconsin-Stout on sediment chemistry. They provide a lot of data throughout this process that you'll see today. So here's what I'd like to accomplish today. I'd like to talk just briefly about watershed phosphorus cycle. What are some of the sources and our typical management approaches? And then I'll really dive into constructed ponds. And I'm going to include what I call stormwater wetlands. These are ponds or wetlands that have been plumbed into the stormwater system and used for phosphorus or water quality control. So we'll talk a little bit about design, what the sediment phosphorus burial and release process is, and what the implications are for overall watershed phosphorus processing. And then talking about understanding and managing the watershed phosphorus pools. How do we go about doing something about improving phosphorus cycling in these watersheds to really make a difference? So what's the problem that we're facing? This is the outlet monitoring station for the Shingle Creek watershed. Shingle Creek is a first-tier suburb in the Twin Cities metropolitan area. And they put a lot of effort into trying to reduce phosphorus over the past 10 to 15 years. Since 2005, they've invested almost $12 million in water quality projects throughout the watershed. Municipalities put almost another $3 million in, and MnDOT has put another $2 million in. This is a tune of almost $17 million, and you can see in the trend on the box plot here, I don't know if the pointer works here, but you can see there's very little movement in terms of phosphorus. Now, my statistician will tell me it's a significant trend, but you can see for almost 17 million, it's very frustrating to put all that work and effort and not see really noticeable movement in the phosphorus concentration. So we started asking the question, why is this? Why are we having such a struggle with reducing phosphorus loading? Here's a study that's for Bass Lake, Pomerleau here. Flows down into Bass Lake, and Schmidt Lake comes in. And we did a 5-year TMDL monitoring review for that process. And so as a part of that process, what was interesting was we had phosphorus loading from a developing part of the watershed and from some areas where we were doing some stormwater retrofits and ponds, rain gardens, and some of those processes. And what you see is the phosphorus concentrations aren't really that high for an urban area, running between 170 and 200 micrograms per liter, but it was a soluble reactive phosphorus, that dissolved fraction, that was really surprising to us, where it made up a third or almost a half of the phosphorus loading into these lakes. And so we started asking the question, what's going on here? Why are we seeing this upward trend of dissolved phosphorus in the watershed while we're decreasing the amount of particulate matter that's coming into these? You know, we're having a pretty good success with TSS and some of the particulate phosphorus. That led us to start thinking about this in some different ways. So when we think about watershed phosphorus management, there's kind of two ways we can control phosphorus in the watershed, the way I look at it. There's a phosphorus source management, right? This is what I would call behavioral types of projects, where you have to get people to change how they manage the sources of phosphorus. A phosphorus fertilizer ban was put in place in the Twin Cities metropolitan area, so that reduced the amount of phosphorus that goes in the watershed. Homeowner practices, how you deal with grass clippings, leaf litter, runoff management from your yard, some of these types of things, or street sweeping is more a behavior, how cities go out and sweep their streets. And you're going to hear more about some of these things from the other speakers. But what's interesting to me is, these are much more difficult because you have to change the behavior one by one of individual homeowners, or you have to go into home associations and do that. So being local government units and trying to do things that we know we can do, we really turned to more engineering approaches. And that was where we really put in sinks in the watershed. Constructed ponds to settle particulate phosphorus. We started to build these to settle phosphorus and get them out. We plumbed the wetlands into our stormwater system. The paradigm has always been for wetlands, if you put stormwater in a wetland, it comes out cleaner, so it's better. Is that really true, and where does that go? And then rain gardens and biofilters. So I'm going to focus on constructed ponds and stormwater wetlands is what I'm going to call them, and how they're operating and where we may be seeing some limitations in this process. So here's a standard constructed pond design. This is from the Minnesota Stormwater Manual, and you can see it, drainage comes into a forebay. It overflows into a permanent pool. You try to keep it at 6 to 8 feet deep to prevent anoxia. so you don't get re-release of sediment, and then it discharges out there. We typically size this for a 2.5-inch 24-hour rainfall event, so that you want your dead pool storage to be equal to that runoff volume, and then you'll get about 50% of the phosphorus removal based on a modeling basis. So this is how we design a pond. This is standard construction. So moving forward, just kind of keep that in mind. So we got to start thinking about once phosphorus enters into the pond, what happens to that phosphorus? How does it cycle? So here you can see this is from Sundergaard. It's just a simple representation. Phosphorus comes into the pond as either dissolved or a particulate fraction. The particulate fraction can sediment out and report to the sediments. The dissolved fraction will be taken up by algae and eventually sediment out from the pond, or it can flow through the pond to the outlet. Once it gets to the sediments, it can report to a number of different areas. It can be buried, so it's physically removed from superficial cycling, so it's no longer active in surface waters. Or it can report to a number of different phosphorus fractions, and I have those over here. These phosphorus fractions, iron, most of these are metal hydroxides that will bond phosphorus in the sediments. So iron, alum or aluminum is what we're looking at, calcium, and they're pretty permanent bonds. Some of these are more sensitive to environmental conditions than others. So iron fractions are sensitive to low dissolved oxygen. So phosphorus that binds to an iron hydroxide will be released under anoxic conditions. So we get this internal cycling in ponds. When we constructed the pond, we thought, oh, once it reports to the sediments, it's gone and we don't have to worry about it again. But what we're really seeing in ponds is some recycling of this phosphorus that may be undoing some of the efforts that we're putting in there. So what causes sediment phosphorus release? If we look at sediment redox reactions, once, excuse me, once the pond goes anoxic, you start to go through reduction and oxidation reactions in the sediments. So as you reduce all the oxygen out, then it goes to nitrate. You start to reduce all the nitrate. Once that's gone, you start reducing iron. But once you start hitting the iron reduction in your redox reactions, you start to release any phosphorus that was complex to that iron hydroxide. And so that releases up into the water column. It releases into a dissolved form that is readily available for algal uptake. And it's actually more problematic than some of the particulate forms. So we know if anoxia occurs, we're starting to release iron, and we're going to release the phosphorus that goes with it. So then we got to look at what's the phosphorus pool in the sediment. So typically what happens, and this is from a lake sediment, but the same thing happens in a pond, is as you increase the amount of stormwater that comes into it, it brings a lot of particulate matter that settles out, and you end up with a phosphorus bulge in the superficial sediments. So this is just my sediment depth profile in centimeters, every 2 centimeters, and then this is just a mobile phosphorus fraction. So it's that fraction of phosphorus that's readily available under anoxic conditions in the sediments. So as we increase the superficial concentrations or the mass of phosphorus in the superficial, we have more available for release, and we get a greater mass of release from that sediment. And really what we're trying to do is manage it to this small amount of a release. All sediments will release some phosphorus into the water column, but we're trying to keep this managed as a small amount. So what do we have to worry about with ponds? We have 2 things we got to worry about. Is it going anoxic, which will drive the release of phosphorus, and are we accumulating a high mass of phosphorus that's in this highly mobile form so it's susceptible to recycling? That's what we're trying to understand. So my engineers will tell me, oh, you don't have to worry about anoxia in the ponds. We only make them 6 to 8 feet deep, so they're not going to go anoxic. There's plenty of surface area. They're going to mix to the bottom. You're not going to have anoxia. So I took some data from the Riley Purgatory Bluff Creek Watershed District, where they measured 4 times 6 different ponds in the cities of Chanhassen and Eden Prairie. And this is the dissolved oxygen concentration up here, and then this is just depth in the water column. And what you see, not only do these ponds go anoxic regularly in this period, the anoxia is as shallow as 3 feet when you look at less than 2 milligrams per liter. So there's significant amount of anoxia occurring in these ponds, and it makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of sediment oxygen demand that'll consume that oxygen very quickly and goes in there. So we know in ponds we're having anoxia, that can cause us some release problems. So let's look at the release part. I'll take you through a case study. This It's actually a stormwater wetland. I call it Egan Pond JP5, but it's a stormwater wetland. Fish Lake, which is highly managed in the city of Egan, flows into the pond here in the middle, and then this flows out to Blackhawk Lake. And so there was some concern. There's too much water coming through the pond. We weren't getting the settling we want, but we were even more concerned that there was release from the sediments that was undoing a lot of that clean water coming out of Fish Lake and causing problems for the downstream lake. So we decided to go out and collect sediment cores, stations 5, 6, the deep hole, 7 in the northern part, and measure release of phosphorus in sediment chemistry to see if this process was going on. So these black lines, I'm going to show you a cross-section of this pond. That's what these black lines are. This is just how we cut the cross-section through there. So we went out and collected cores. We take them back to the laboratory. We make the cores go anoxic. We measure phosphorus release. Under anaerobic or anoxic conditions devoid of oxygen, we measure the release rate here of 5.2 milligrams per meter squared per day. That's a pretty high rate when you think about how much phosphorus is coming back out of the sediments. Another important thing to recognize here is we measured it under aerobic conditions, and this will occur all summer, and we even had 0.6 milligrams per meter squared per day coming out of the sediments. Now, that's a low rate, and that's manageable, but when we do modeling to understand the effectiveness of our stormwater ponds, we're not accounting for this release out of the sediments. So we're overestimating just off the start how much phosphorus removal we're getting out of these ponds. So we know the pond has the potential to release a fair amount of phosphorus throughout the summer. So what's going on in the pond? So this is the cross-section of the pond that I told you. This is the deep hole of the pond where it goes, comes out of Fish Lake and then discharges to Blackhawk Lake. This is that northern basin. The red line here is the depth at which we've measured anoxia. Okay? And so the first thing you notice here is that almost half of the bottom sediments go anoxic in this pond, which can create a lot of release of phosphorus. The water level is the green line up here. These are our mobile phosphorus profiles every 2 centimeters in the different areas of the pond. Now, typically, we like to manage sediments to be less than 0.1 milligrams per gram of mobile phosphorus. That's when we see low release rates and it's pretty manageable. If you look at the concentration of the deep hole, it's almost 2 to 3 milligrams per gram. It's really, really high. And we don't see many ponds like that, but there is a ton of mobile phosphorus sitting in the bottom of this pond, and that's going to be easily mobilized when we see this amount of anoxia going on in that system. So this pond definitely is contributing phosphorus to surface waters and undoing a lot of the work and money that we spent upstream trying to manage phosphorus that's going in there. It's not as high in some of the shallower areas, but there's still a fair amount of mobile phosphorus. Now, just to give you some idea, the red line is your iron-bound phosphorus, so that's the most susceptible to redox reactions. The blue line is your labile phosphorus. This is what's in that easily degraded carbon fraction that's in the bottom sediments. So that can contribute on a longer term to phosphorus release. And the black line is what we call loosely bound. This is what's sitting in your pore water, hasn't really bound anything, can be easily mobilized into the surface waters. So a lot of iron-bound phosphorus, a fair amount of labile phosphorus in this. So this is not unique to this pond. We went out and we measured 11 ponds throughout the city of Egan to try to ask the question, is this a problem in all our ponds, or is this just unique to 1 or 2 ponds? So these are the phosphorus fractions. The loosely bound is your dark blue. The second part of the bar here is your iron-bound, releasable under anoxic conditions, and then the bottom is your labile, which will release under slower conditions. And we found a fair amount of releasable phosphorus. Again, if our target's typically less than 0.1, we've got some of these ponds that are up at 0.5 and 0.6. That's a large pool of phosphorus susceptible to recycling in these ponds, and we know these ponds are going anoxic. So the city of Egan is really looking at and asking the question, how do we start to incorporate this into the management of our stormwater system? Okay, so let's shift gears into a typical standard stormwater pond monitoring program. This is a pond inspection program that we've been working on since 2010 with the city of Eden Prairie. They're required under their MS4 permit to inspect a certain proportion of their stormwater ponds to measure whether they're filling in, are they losing dead storage, so they're no longer effective in storing. identify those with maintenance issues, are there pipes that are degrading, are there deltas, that kind of thing. And then identifying critical ponds in the system. Now, to give you an idea of what a city like Eden Prairie in Minnesota is facing, they have over 1,400 stormwater ponds and wetlands plumbed in their system, and they're about a 36 square mile city. That's a lot of wetlands and very diffuse throughout the city to try to manage and figure out how do we manage phosphorus cycling in there. They're a mix of private and public ownership. They don't have access to all the ponds either. Many of them are on private lands, and that's a problem. To date, they've been systematically working through the city to inspect all these, and they spent almost $1 million in inspection costs to go out and do this. It's a lot of money, and I'm going to argue that we've gotten little benefit out of that inspection program. It could be simplified. So I'm going to break it down. I can't go through the whole city, but I'm going to break it down to a lake that we're looking at close in the city of Eden Prairie here. This is the Mitchell Lake watershed. It's about a 120-acre shallow lake, average depth of about 5 feet, and it has almost a 950-acre watershed. In this watershed, there's about 45 stormwater ponds and stormwater wetlands that needed to be inspected to try to understand what's the phosphorus loading to Mitchell Lake, how can we manage it, where is it coming from? So if we look closer, these are 3 ponds that you'll run into, 3 different standard kinds of ponds. So this is a small subwatershed of Mitchell Lake. There's a large commercial industrial area to the western part that drains through the stormwater pond, standard practice for newer developments. And then it comes down through a number of stormwater wetlands before it reaches this stormwater wetland here and then discharges to Mitchell Lake. And then the southwest part has the same kind of complex drainage. 1814B, that's this pond right here, looks like this. This is a typical stormwater wetland, believe it or not. This stormwater wetland's been flooded by a lot of stormwater. We piped a lot of stormwater into it, so we deepened it in that time. We've been using it for settling. If we look at a constructed pond, 1813A on the bottom here is more of a constructed pond. You can see it's pretty circular in nature. It's constructed to the design standards that we talked about before. And then somewhere in between are ponds like this. This is a flooded wetland that has an open water area here that comes off the road, drains down into this very boggy, kind of marshy area, goes through another open water area, and then discharges to the lake. Okay, so these are difficult stormwater ponds to deal with. How are these really functioning? We put these into our standard water quality modeling where we just look at settling. Are we overestimating or underestimating their effectiveness? What's really going on in these systems? So if we look at these a little bit closer, to remember those 3, this is what your typical pond inspection results would look like. We'd go out, we'd measure the permanent pool, and then we'd ask the question, is it designed to standards? And we use the National Urban Runoff Program standards, and then we've come up with a rapid way to understand if it's meeting those standards or not. So we just take from the watershed what the 2.5-inch 24-hour event's going to be, calculate that water volume, and compare it to the dead storage volume. If you have a ratio of 1, it's designed exactly to standards. Greater than 1, it's over the NERC standards and should be providing extra treatment to that watershed. If it's under that number, then it's underbuilt and needs additional dead storage. This is purely from a particulate phosphorus settling perspective. We're not talking about the dissolved fraction at this point. We're not talking about release. And so these ponds, all of these ponds are well designed or over-designed. 1841B is very large for the watershed and the amount of runoff. There should be no problem with the amount of settling that's going on there. And then we can calculate the percent removal of total phosphorus based on that residence time in Stokes' law, just using P8. And then we come up with an estimated concentration. If this was the case in stormwater ponds and we had an estimated somewhere 100 to 150 micrograms per liter of phosphorus, we'd be doing very well in this watershed. Riley Purgatory Bluff Creek watershed went out and monitored it, and in 1841B, they got an average concentration, this is 8 samples, average concentration over 2 years of 1.9 milligrams per liter. That's a hot pond, a lot of phosphorus coming out of that pond. It's certainly not coming from the watershed. Where is it coming from? Almost all of these ponds, we over-predicted the amount of settling and the effectiveness for phosphorus control. Why is that? Is it an internal loading problem? What's going on in these ponds? So this is pretty common if you start to look at a broader scale across Eden Prairie where we had monitoring data from the watershed district. The orange bar here is our monitored data for phosphorus, and the green bar is our predicted from the P8 model using Stokes' law. In almost all of these cases, except for one, there's always be one oddball in the group, we've way over predicted how effective these ponds are in treating phosphorus. And in fact, we have some significant ponds that are discharging, releasing phosphorus back into the system that's going to undo a lot of the effort that we put into managing these ponds. So I would argue we've really got to start thinking about what's going on the internal cycling of these ponds. How do we manage that so we keep the phosphorus in those sediments, since we built this as a sink and wanted it to be a permanent sequestration of that phosphorus? So how do we do that? This is the City of Eagan. We're working on Carlson and Quigley Lake. This is Carlson Lake and Quigley. We have two major ponds that logistically were very difficult to do any kind of work in. They're very hard to get into. Any expansion, they're already oversized. So we asked the question, is internal loading a problem in these lakes? So you can calculate from your pond area, figure out what your release rate is from your lab experiments, and we know that any given year they're discharging 9.7 to 4.9 pounds per year. You can use our model data from PondNet in this case and figure out what's our sedimentation rate, right? We just take that equation, figure out the sedimentation rate, and what you find is that LP41 is actually a source of phosphorus. There's more sediment phosphorus release going on a mass basis than actual settling. So this pond is not helping the system, it's hurting the system with that legacy phosphorus that's in there. The case is a little bit better for LP44, where it's settling more than it's releasing, but we're not getting near the effectiveness that we wanted, and the released form is a soluble reactive phosphorus that's more problematic. Then we can calculate how much phosphorus, how much is sitting there waiting to be released in a mass basis in the top 5 centimeters. This is just that iron-bound fraction. And then if we look at the labile organic fraction, that increases it even more. That's going to release slower in that process. So there's a significant amount of phosphorus sitting in the bottom of these ponds waiting to be released to undo all the efforts that we're putting out there. So how do we go about fixing it? So first, you got to start accounting for it when you're doing. If you really want to know what your phosphorus cycling is, you got to account for that internal loading. Then you got to ask the question, what can we do about it? Sediment excavation and disposal is the typical approach, right? We go out, we increase the dead storage to improve settling. We think that's going to increase the effectiveness. We could go out and say we're going to dredge that pond to remove high phosphorus sediments. I think that's problematic because of the way that these ponds are set up, and we'll talk about that a little bit. We can use metal hydroxides for phosphorus inactivation, where you can add aluminum, iron, lanthanum. There's lots of different metal hydroxides that are on the market that can be effective for minimizing the release of phosphorus from these pond sediments. And that's what this is actually an alum treatment on a lake here in the Twin Cities, where we're doing the same thing for the bottom sediments in the lake. Or we can manage dissolved oxygen. This is much more difficult. This takes an aerator, a fountain, takes much more engineering approach. When you're a city of Eden Prairie with 1,400 ponds, you want 1,400 aeration systems. Really probably not an effective approach. We'll talk about that a little bit. Okay, so sediment removal and disposal. This is what we did was we just looked on a cost per pound basis if we were to go out and expand these ponds. It's really not very cost effective. Typically, you're getting small additional removal by cleaning out this pond, 0.3 to 1.4 pounds of additional removal in a year. That's very minimal when you're talking about TMDLs that require hundreds of pounds reductions, and you're doing it at a high cost, anywhere from $2,000 to $8,000 per pound of removal on a 30-year life cycle cost. So it's very expensive. It's not really practical in the Twin Cities because so many of these are stormwater wetlands where we have the Wetland Conservation Act laws to deal with, and so that can be kind of a problem. And the other problem is a lot of these sediments are contaminated with PAHs, so disposal costs can be very high. You got to take them to a landfill. We can't reuse those sediments. So this is what I would say a very ineffective practice and not very cost effective. So we've been looking at a lot of these types of practices and projects we've been doing, and what we're finding is that anytime you start to add adsorption media, so these metal hydroxides, something to bind it and hold it in the system, the cost effectiveness of your BMP increases significantly. So if you look at some of these diffuse watershed practices, we're talking about rain gardens, large structural, new ponds. This is the cost per pound removal. Expanding the basin's about, on average, $3,500 per pound. But when you add in iron-enhanced sand filtration or a bit of expansion and filtration, your cost effectiveness and your ability to remove phosphorus goes up significantly. And then the addition of alum, aluminum sulfate, or some phosphorus-binding chemical is typically one of our most cost-effective approaches. So this is a way to go through and do that. So can we, I get this question a lot, can we just dig out the phosphorus-laden sediment and get rid of that? These, again, are JP5's phosphorus profiles, and what I'll show you is this is only the top 15 centimeters of data, but if you look in the bottom here, you're still at 0.2 to 0.4 milligrams per gram in phosphorus. For it to really reduce that phosphorus spike, they need to be under 0.1. The other problem is it can be hard to not resuspend some of the sediments if you're doing this when the water's still there, so that phosphorus-laden sediment just resettles on top of what you excavated. And without a deeper profile, it's hard to know, can you reach deep enough into the ponds to where you have low phosphorus sediments? So this is something I think that warrants more research in terms of the cost effectiveness, but our experience is that it's very difficult to really get at the phosphorus this way, and excavation costs can be quite expensive. So we're bigger fans, how am I doing on time? I'm running out of time here, okay. Of using phosphorus inactivation approach. We can use aluminum sulfate. Aluminum sulfate dissociates in water to form aluminum hydroxide. Aluminum hydroxide is a metal hydroxide that will bind phosphorus in a complexation, and that's it's a permanent bond. It's not susceptible to anoxia. pH would have to go very low to break that bond, below 2, something you would never see in the environment. So we've used this since the 1970s in lakes. We've learned a lot about that. Can we use this in ponds? If we take those 2 pond examples that we did before, LP 44 and 41, what you can say is, what would it take for the initial alum inactivation cost? And that's to take the top 5 centimeters, bind it on aluminum so that it can't ever be released. So it's 137,000, 39,000 respectively. And then you can say, the new phosphorus that comes into the pond, how often do I need to retreat? Do I need to be out there every 5 years to inactivate the new phosphorus that might have some releasable? And you can do that by estimating what you think those fractions would be based on the sediment chemistry. And in this case, we thought it'd be 6 years or 16 years. So for 30 years, LP44, you only need to go out there once or twice. Probably have to go out there 4 or 5 times in LP41. So the cost here is, that's not actually a cost. Total cost for a 30-year life cycle, $187,000, $59,000. Now, I didn't do the excavation costs in this pond, but typically what we find is that these are much more cost-effective than excavating the pond. And plus, you're addressing a different pool. We're now addressing that soluble pool that's sitting in the bottom of the pond rather than just looking at additional settling. Sometimes sediment inactivation is not the right answer. This is a pond where we worked on in Chanhassen. As you can see, all the residents live on this pond here. It's full of duckweed. It smells like rotten eggs. It was a problem for these residents that lived on there. We went out there. It was a clear hydrogen sulfide smell, so it's getting far enough down the redox reaction potential, releasing hydrogen sulfide. In this case, you're better off managing the oxygen cycle to prevent hydrogen sulfide release. That'll get rid of the smells. It'll keep that phosphorus bound into the sediments. And so we recommended doing some aeration in this one. Again, the homeowners were willing to have the discussion about managing the aeration system themselves, so it's easier for the city to take something like that on because the homeowners are willing to have that discussion. So, stormwater ponds for phosphorus control. These systems have a lot of legacy phosphorus in them from years and years of settling phosphorus, and so they're really potential sources of phosphorus. They're offsetting some of the efforts we're putting out for BMPs, and they're transforming it from a particulate phosphorus to a more problematic soluble phosphorus. Quantifying the watershed-wide phosphorus pools is really critical, and understanding how much this is undoing what we're doing and understanding that internal cycle of phosphorus in the ponds is critical to making some movement. And then finally, standard maintenance techniques are really not your most cost-effective approaches. You have to think outside the box and think, do we need to aerate it? Should we use sediment phosphorus inactivation techniques? What's really the best technique for improving that? With that, I'll turn it over. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. That was good. Let me check the chat line here and see if there are some questions. Yeah, I'm going to switch chairs here with Joe real quick. Kind of a weird seating arrangement here, but it works. So let me just check the chat box here and see what we got. don't see any specific questions. I do have one or two for Joe myself here, but one of the questions is, will the slides be available after the webinar? And the answer, I never did ask you if that's okay.
Totally fine, yep.
So yeah, we will be posting all 3 presentations in the Stormwater Manual, and those should be up there by tomorrow at the latest. So, Joe, I do have a question for you. One, and then you kind of touched on it, which is traditionally, and I'm not an engineer, so correct me if I'm wrong here, but traditionally we've kind of built ponds, at least from the beginning, partly for rate control and that type of thing. But has there been any discussion ever of now starting to construct ponds with different designs more for water quality purposes to avoid, say, the issues that you see with anoxia and that type of thing?
Yeah, I think for stormwater ponds, the best thing you can do is go to, excuse me, a regional pond approach. The problem with having 1,400 ponds is so diffuse throughout the city, it's very expensive to create access to those ponds, to get out through the city, know which ones you really have to treat. And so I think a regional pond allows you to do some of the sediment activation, have a constructed access to it, have it set up to do these types of systems. That saves a lot of money for the city from a cost. So I'm a big fan of replumbing the system and trying to go to more regional bases as much as possible.
Okay.
You know, you can keep some of those other ponds that are in there for the rate control, even if they're discharging phosphorus, if you can manage it on a regional basis at a downstream end.
We do have another question here. Are there unintended consequences of adding sulfate, like feeding sulfate reducing bacteria with methylate mercury?
Yeah, so that's a reversible process. Our typical thought in lakes, and most of the research shows that the sulfate concentrations are pretty short-lived in these systems. As soon as the next storm comes in, that flushes out and it dilutes. And any mercury methylation that's occurring in the sediments will reverse back to its original state. So the research and the evidence doesn't really support their increased mercury into the food chain from using the sulfate. Now, if you were doing a continuous feeding system, you would have to do those calculations to make sure that you're not going to increase that, because then it would be a continuous concentration. But these are one-time shots. They usually flush out within a week, and because of that, there's really not much issue with that.
Okay. I'm going to take one more here. And by the way, we will post all the questions and answers. We'll have answers. We're not going to be able to get to all questions because of time constraints, but I'll go with one more here. If iron-bound phosphorus is particularly susceptible to anoxic release, are iron-enhanced practices really a solution?
Iron-enhanced, yes, they are, if you can keep everything oxygenated. So one of the keys to iron-enhanced sand filters is making sure the water that's going through there is oxygenated, so you're getting that iron bonding. Now, the St. Anthony Falls Laboratory is doing a lot of research on different forms of iron, and some forms of iron tend to be less susceptible to anoxia than others. And that's against the traditional paradigm that we understand of iron, but I think that research is really critical. Is iron another option? Under what conditions is it an option? So as long as you're controlling oxygen, iron's great, and even if you're not controlling oxygen, certain forms of iron are showing some potential, but it needs more research.
Okay. Thanks, Joe. And there are a couple other questions, and like I said, we'll post everything with answers in the manual sometime in the week, the next week or so. So, but we do kind of need to move along, so we're going to have our next speaker come up, Dr. Andy Erickson from the University of Minnesota, and again, I'll have him introduce himself so he can tell all the lies. Oh, I'm sorry, yep, I got to pull up his presentation here real quick.
Well, welcome everyone. I'm so glad to be here with you today. My name is Andy Erickson. I'm a research associate at St. Anthony Falls Lab. I do research on stormwater treatment, urban runoff, water quality. We do a lot of different things. You'll see some of that in the presentation. You'll also see some of that in our newsletter, which I'll talk about at the end of the slides. But today I'm happy to be here to talk about phosphorus and biofiltration and what can we do about that. Joe and actually Mike and Ann gave a good introduction to phosphorus and the watersheds and TMDLs and water quality. So I'm going to build off of that to talk specifically about these biofiltration practices. Before I start, I want to acknowledge my collaborators. I work very closely with Professor John Gulliver at the University of Minnesota, Professor Pete Weiss at Valparaiso University. We also rely heavily on our financial sponsors, including the PCA, to do research on these topics. And we also work very closely with many project partners, cities, watershed districts, counties, and other organizations that help us work in the field to collect real-world data and try to take some of the things that we're doing in the lab and get it out in the real world. So thank you. So I'm going to talk about biofiltration, but there's kind of a bigger picture. There's this old concept of bioretention, which gets bounced around very often. And I want to distinguish between bioinfiltration and biofiltration. If you go to the Minnesota Stormwater Manual, you'll find this figure here on bioinfiltration, which doesn't have any underdrains. It's essentially a depression that collects stormwater, and there's a filter media. Once the water goes through that media, it soaks into the soil, underlying soils, and goes to the shallow groundwater. By contrast, if you have a biofiltration system, you install underdrains near the bottom or at the bottom of that media. And there, some of the water that goes through that media will be collected by the underdrains and passed down through the system into the downstream storm sewer or down to a receiving water. Some water will infiltrate. In some cases, if you have a lined biofiltration, then it all goes through the underdrain. But this is a pretty big difference between these practices, where you have 100% infiltration in bioinfiltration, and you're using primarily filtration in the biofiltration practice. In both cases, when you talk about the filter media, it's usually a combination of construction sand, sometimes topsoil, and organic matter, which is typically compost. So that'll come into play here in the next several slides. Now, one of the big advantages of these bioretention or biofiltration practices is there's actually a number of processes that are used to remove stormwater pollutants. We have vegetative processes, which can remove nitrogen and phosphorus when compared to a non-vegetated system. So the vegetation itself is providing benefit for nutrients. Some of the research is showing that if you have longer contact time, you can get more removal of those nutrients. It also shows that the plant uptake really accounts for a pretty small fraction of the phosphorus removal and more of the nitrogen removal, but the soils in these biofiltration practices is what's accounting for a lot of the soluble phosphorus capture. We're getting filtration on the surface of sediment-bound phosphorus, but we're getting microbial activity and absorption processes within the media to capture some of that soluble fraction. So having the vegetation in place, so you create a rhizosphere, a microbial community around the roots of the vegetation, are all beneficial. There are other benefits. I'm just going to touch on a couple before we really focus in on phosphorus. There's other research that shows the compost in these rain gardens or bioretention practices can work very closely with petroleum hydrocarbons, creating a community, a biological community, that can actually biodegrade these petroleum hydrocarbons. They are originally captured through absorption onto the compost or the organic matter, then biodegraded to carbon dioxide and other end products, so that these rain gardens or bioretention practices are really a sustainable and effective method for reducing these petroleum hydrocarbons we see in stormwater. We also see capture of metals onto this organic matter. And again, this is some of the work that we did at St. Anthony Falls Lab, and we looked at a variety of different compost ratios from 10% up to 50% compost. And even for a roughly 12-inch depth of media, you can capture metals for decades or even hundreds of years. And I think really the end point of this graph is that a little compost can go a long way when you're talking about metals. And in reality, I've seen this with other things as well, petroleum hydrocarbons, and as long as you kind of create the substrate where you can get a microbial community that's healthy, a lot of these processes will be effective. But one of the downsides, which has kind of been alluded to, and as I'm sure you saw in the abstracts, is that we have leaching of phosphorus from these organic materials. And we've measured that here at the laboratory. We've also seen that in a number of other studies from many, many research institutions, both in the lab and in the field. And there is a relationship where if you have more compost or more organic material, you have more potential release of phosphorus. And that's an issue. If we look back at our design, we also may have topsoil. So what if we have a naturally organic topsoil or a high phosphorus content topsoil? And that's also part of our mix. Now we've increased that potential for additional phosphorus release. So really, what can we do about this? Well, we have a couple options. We can reduce the organic matter, and I'm not a plant specialist, but the ones that I've talked to have said that even 3 to maybe 5% organic matter can be sufficient to support the vegetation, especially during establishment. If you have enough water and you have this roughly amount of organic matter, the plant's established, and then over time, as the roots decay and other organic matter comes into the system, it becomes self-sustaining very quickly. So we can really reduce that mass and reduce that potential for phosphorus release. We can also test those materials for phosphorus content, and there's a lot of guidance in the Minnesota Stormwater Manual on this specifically. I would recommend, there are some numbers out there on the compost, you can do some additional testing on that, but especially if you're incorporating any kind of topsoil in your filtration media, it's important to test that for phosphorus content and find out how much is there. Now beyond that, what I'm going to use the balance of my time is to talk about some of these amendments that we can add to our designs to try to target some of that phosphorus, specifically the soluble fraction, to try to remove it from the system before it gets to those underdrains in a biofiltration system. So what can we use to learn from? Well, we use some chemical processes, and Joe alluded to some of those already. This is actually a stormwater treatment facility that's using alum coagulation and flocculation to treat stormwater, but this is a very active system. As Joe was talking about, you have to manage the system, you have to have correct dosing, you have to remove that material over time, but we can use that concept in our biofiltration practices. There's actually been a number of research studies now looking at what are called water treatment residuals. This is actually alum and other aluminum products that we use to treat drinking water, typically. When they end their useful life in the water treatment plant, they still have some absorption capacity for phosphorus, and they've been used as a media amendment or enhancement to biofiltration and rain garden systems, both in the laboratory and in the field. This is some laboratory data here, and I provide all of the references on all the slides, but I can share those with you as well if you're interested. But this is showing that we can reduce those concentrations of soluble phosphorus significantly by orders of magnitude just by adding a relatively small amount of water treatment residual. However, there are some cautions there. Dosing is very critical, as Joe mentioned as well. We need to understand exactly what we're putting in there and how much we're putting in to be effective, and what is that long-term lifespan, and when will it need to be replaced. And especially when we're looking at water treatment residuals or any other amendments that might be a waste product, what other impurities are in that media? We might be removing phosphorus, but are we contributing something else to the system that's far more dangerous or has a much bigger impact? So that's the thing I always recommend when anybody asks me, have you looked at such and such as a media? And the first thing I ask is, well, what else is in there? So what's the purity level and what's the content of other things that we should be concerned with? We can also look at other commercial absorbents. There's a number of products out on the market. Some are in the Minnesota Stormwater Manual, some are in other manuals and other guidance documents. And there's a variety of them that are used to remove not only nutrients like phosphorus, but also metals and hydrocarbons and pesticides and toxics. So in some ways, you can get a big bang for your buck by removing all of these things. Some of these have had third-party testing, some have not. We've done some of that work at the laboratory at St. Anthony Falls, and we've published that information. But all of those have a finite absorption capacity. So you need to know how long will it last and how long will it remain effective to know when it needs to be replaced. And you need to know beyond just, for example, phosphorus, because a lot of these medias will retain other things besides phosphorus that will then reduce the overall capacity. So you might think you have 30 years of capacity for phosphorus, but once it's removing other things out of the water, you might have 15 years total capacity. So you need to think about how everything that's in the water that's coming into the system will affect that long-term performance. We've done a lot of work with iron specifically at St. Anthony Falls Lab, and this started with really just enhancing pure sand filtration. Prior to looking at bioretention, we had sand filters that we added steel wool or iron filings. We found very good results. Just adding 2 or even 5% iron can capture almost 80 or up to 90% of the soluble phosphorus in the inflow. And in many cases, depending on how these practices are sized and designed, they can last for many years. I'm sure many of you have seen some of the results of that work. Many of these iron enhanced sand filters have been installed in the field. This is an example from Maplewood. But we've tried to take this concept, and I know other engineers and designers have constructed biofiltration or bioretention practices that combine this iron-enhanced sand treatment system with the benefits that we get from the bioretention soil mixes. This is an example from the Maplewood Mall, if anybody's been out there recently, that was redone with, I believe, 55 rain gardens that have a iron-enhanced sand trench in the center portion there. You can see it with the yellow arrow there. That's pure iron sand, where it's 95% sand and 5% iron by weight. Along the side slopes, a bioretention soil mix, which has a construction sand. I don't know if there's topsoil mixed in with this as well, but I do know that there was compost as organic material mixed in. You can see it there as the black soil. And then that's set off on the sides, on the side slopes, so that any water that comes from that bioretention soil mix has to go through the iron-enhanced sand filter trench before it gets to the underdrains underneath. In this case, we get our benefits of all the vegetative processes. This is an example of what it looks like after the fact. All the vegetative processes, both on the surface and in the soil and on the rhizosphere, in the rhizosphere area around the roots. We get the metal removal, we get biodegradation in that soil, but then any organic soluble phosphorus that might be in the water or any phosphorus that might come from the organics or the compost in the bioretention mix is then captured in the iron-enhanced sand filter in the bottom of that trench. That's one design that you can incorporate both iron and compost. This is another design that we've been considering. This is actually a layered system where you have a compost amended sand on the surface, an iron-enhanced sand layer, and then a gravel subbase with underdrain. In this case, water comes in and has to go through that compost layer first. We'll go through the iron-enhanced sand layer second, and then finally go through to the underdrains. Again, the advantages here is you get all the benefits of that biologically active compost layer. You get the phosphorus removal and additional filtration in the iron sand layer before it gets to that underdrain system. There has been some testing of this concept. This was actually experiments that were done at Valparaiso University in Indiana. These are kind of rectangular square mesocosms that were rained on with phosphorus-laden water. It was a layer of 15 centimeters of gravel on the bottom, about 46 centimeters of sand in one, and a sand-iron mix in the other. And then on top of that, a 30 centimeter layer of compost sand mix. The results from that work showed that if you did not incorporate iron, which are the black lines on this chart, you'd get somewhere between 50 and 60% reduction in the total phosphorus and the soluble reactive phosphorus initially, but after a certain period of time, you'd really get no benefit in terms of phosphorus removal from that system. And in fact, you could argue that the total phosphorus and soluble phosphorus is actually being leached out of that system. However, if you have that sand layer that's mixed with iron in the middle, you can keep your removals from 90 to maybe 100% most of the time, even dipping down to 75% or better. So we can see just through the lab studies that these systems can work, these multi-layered amended systems. However, we do need long-term data. There's certainly a lot of work that can be done here to find out how these systems work in the long term and how quickly they need to be replaced or rejuvenated, and also what is the oxygen impact on these type of systems. Because that iron sand layer is buried, it's not open to the atmosphere on the top, what kind of impacts could that have long term on that oxic state in that layer? I also want to caution that not all iron is created equal. We've done studies, as Joe alluded to, on a number of different iron sources and iron products, both locally and beyond. We've seen a wide variety of iron content from 30% to over 90%. Then the balance is impurities. In some cases, you can have some pretty high content of metals of concern like cadmium, copper, chromium. You could have lubricants and other organics or hydrocarbons that could be issues depending on where that source is coming from. We've also found, surprisingly, that some of these irons are not reactive with phosphorus. So we found irons that are very high iron content, very low impurity. On paper, they should work great, but you put them in a cup of phosphorus-laden water and they don't do anything. So we're understanding, as Joe mentioned, some of the different types of iron that work well for phosphorus and some that don't. You also have to consider the particle size. a lot of these iron products can come in very, very fine particle sizes on the order of silks and even smaller. And for a biofiltration system, you could probably have a very hard time keeping that material in the media. I could see that flushing through very quickly and not really providing you benefit in the long term. So it's important to understand that particle size and how you're going to mix it into your biofiltration media mix. Now, if you want to find out more about kind of the research that's been done on bioretention in general and phosphorus, as well as many other pollutants, and stormwater specifically, I highly recommend this review article. That was done actually by faculty and students and staff at the University of Minnesota. It was published in 2015. This is pretty heavily cited and is actually cites a number of many studies over the last 10 or 20 years. It talks about nutrients and talking about not only absorption, but microbial activity and vegetative processes. It talks about metals and organic pollutants, and really talks about the entire fate and transport process of these pollutants throughout a bioretention system. So if you want to see more data like what I showed today, this is the first place to start, and then from beyond that, go to not only the papers it references, but the papers that have referenced it since 2015. If you want to know more about some of the work that we're doing at the University of Minnesota in terms of stormwater, you can sign up for our Stormwater Updates newsletter. This comes out by email. You can sign up for it at our webpage, which is simply stormwater.safl.umn.edu. You can also contact me directly. My email address is at the end of these slides. You can feel free to email me and I'll sign you up myself. You'll also find on our webpage past articles of updates, as well as references to our journal articles and project reports and other information on all of our stormwater related projects. So kind of in summary or conclusion, I think we've shown that biofiltration practices are both robust stormwater treatment practices, but also you could call them multidisciplinary, in that they're using physical, chemical, biological processes to remove many pollutants, including phosphorus. For our biofiltration system specifically, we add compost and sometimes topsoil to support the vegetation and that microbial activity in the rhizosphere, but that can release phosphate. So some of the things we can do is reduce the amount of compost we put into these systems. Commonly, we see 10% or even 30% compost in the mixes, and I really recommend getting down to 3 or even 5% compost if we can, to be able to just really establish the vegetation and get that system started on the right foot, and that'll minimize the potential for release in the long term. I'd also recommend testing the media for phosphorus content. Compare that to guidelines that are out there. If we understand what we're putting into these systems, we can have a better idea of what to expect to come out. And then, of course, we can add amendments. There's water treatment residuals, there's iron, there's other commercial absorbents out on the market. Many of these are viable. I do think there's much more work that could be done on these to understand cost effectiveness and lifespan and other interactions with the kind of complex water chemistry that we see in these urban stormwater runoff systems. But I think there are some good options out there to improve our phosphorus capture. And so with that, if we have some time, I can answer some questions, although you can also contact me by email. I'd be happy to chat more after the webinar as well.
Okay, we're going to play musical chairs here real quick and then see if we've got some questions here for Andy. Here's one. If iron-bound phosphorus is particularly, that was from the previous presentation, so let me see if we've got some other questions here.
And I know we're short on time, so I'm okay skipping questions because I'm sure people have to leave.
Is there, checking for questions here. We've got some questions for ponds, but I want to focus on some questions for Andy first, and we can come back if there's time. Quick question here about which manual are you referencing? I assume you're referencing the Minnesota Stormwater Manual.
That's correct, yep.
And we'll show you the link to that at the end of this presentation, or at the end of this webinar. Okay, here's a question. Many watersheds allow biofiltration systems to be upsized to meet their infiltration standard. Is this upsizing providing any benefits? What is the best approach when infiltration is not feasible? pond upsizing versus iron enhanced types of treatment. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but.
Yeah, so the challenges obviously with upsizing is, there's always issues with scaling, understanding lifespan and how much water can you reasonably treat before you have overflow. Obviously, anything that overflows is not treated. You also want to have some retention time within that soil media. As I mentioned on one of the slides, if we have more time in the media, we get more benefits. So if we increase the size of these practices too large and increase the flow through these systems too much, we can really reduce that retention time and really minimize the benefits we get on these soluble pollutants. And so that's where I really see kind of some of the downsides of upscaling these systems too large. But again, if it's designed properly, if you consider that retention time, both in the practice and in the media itself before it gets to the underdrains, if you're sizing that appropriately and you have, you're minimizing bypass, you're treating as much water as possible, then I feel like these systems can work very well. And we've seen in the research and in the literature some rather large bioretention, biofiltration systems work well. But they have to be sized properly and they have to be maintained. You have to understand what is that long-term lifespan and what needs to be done to keep them working.
Another question here, actually, two that kind of go together. As the iron-enhanced sand takes on and binds to the nutrients, do they lose their effectiveness over time? And if so, does it need to be removed and replaced at some point? Absolutely. So like I said, there is a finite capacity for really any absorbent that we might add or any amendment. It's important to understand what that capacity is going in, as well as what other things can use up those absorption sites. So it's certainly possible that other ions in the water will use that up, and it will reduce the capacity and the effectiveness on a much shorter time scale than you might expect. I always recommend collecting samples. Even if you just collect some grab samples of the outflow occasionally, you'll kind of see how this thing is performing in terms of what's coming out of the system over time. And that can give you an idea if your amendments are running out of capacity and running out of life. Okay.
Absolutely.
What is the additional cost for installation and maintenance for adding an iron filter?
In most cases, it varies. It does depend on size a little bit and scale. Shipping costs can be pretty expensive for some of the iron products. But I've seen cost estimates that as low as 5% additional cost to add iron. I've seen some of the initial ones, again, when we were still kind of learning how to do this, how to build these things in the field, as high as maybe 20% additional construction cost. But still, 20% additional is not much when you get at a fraction that you can't normally touch at all. But if you can get it down to 5%, that's usually very good. In terms of maintenance, they do need a bit more inspection. Filtration practices in general require more maintenance than most other stormwater treatment practices. And when you look at biofiltration, you also have to manage that vegetation. So there's not really a lot of additional maintenance when you're talking about iron, other than having to replace the entire media once it's filled up.
And one thing that maybe I would add to that too is when you're considering additional costs, you have to remember that if you have a biofiltration system that's actually contributing to a water quality impairment or a constructed pond that's contributing, you have to look at the costs downstream to that receiving water body and or not giving that restored too. So I would touch on so sometimes the extra cost is worth that benefit in the backside. Is there a movement by watersheds and municipalities to promote or require use of iron-enhanced sand?
I don't know if there's any watersheds, and maybe somebody else might know this better than me. I don't know if there's any watersheds that are necessarily pushing some of these systems, but I know a lot of watershed districts now allow these kind of amended systems, whereas previously the rules were just kind of written that you couldn't do it. I've seen a lot more flexibility in the rules to allow these systems, and in some cases it's the only thing you can use right now. It's kind of the state of the art. When you have systems where you have very high soluble fractions and you can't remove it any other way, unless you're going to go to a very actively managed system. So.
And then there's a question here which I'll take a stab at, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, which is what about pretreatment for solids prior to bioretention? I think the concern here isn't so much the pretreatment, it's what's happening in the biofiltration system and with the compost leaching and the phosphorus. So that's the concern. I'm not sure pretreatment would
well, pretreatment does change that treatment train system a little bit, so you can get conversions within the pretreatment systems, which could affect what's coming into your biofiltration. But again, I think if a biofiltration system is designed properly and sized properly, I feel like it should work adequately. It's certainly going to ease maintenance on your biofiltration if you have a pretreatment system in terms of removing sediment, because then you're not having to try to remove sediment around these densely vegetated systems.
And there is, looks like there's some more questions coming in, but I think we're going to move on. I will ask one real quick question, if you wouldn't mind, just really quickly. You touched on it a little bit in your talk, but this seems to be an area of active research. If you could just briefly mention a couple things that might be coming down the pike and in the next few years, research-wise?
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of work and a lot of effort looking at some of these advanced treatment systems, looking at different media. We've done some of that work in the past, but I know some of that's going to come back around again. We at St. Anthony Falls Laboratory actually do a lot of third-party testing for vendors. So we'll do whether that's a structural practice or absorbent media. So that is still kind of coming through the system, and that's growing. I do know that there's certainly going to be work in the near future, at least we're hoping to do work in the near future on these treatment train systems where we're combining multiple different treatment practices in series and trying to understand how do we get the most bang for our buck and what's the most cost-effective kind of balance of different practices to get at everything we really need to control.
Great. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you so much.
Good stuff. Again, just a reminder for those of you, I'm sure most of you are aware, we had some technical difficulties early, so we are running a little behind here. Please stay with us. Dr. Sarah Hobby now will be the next speaker to talk about trees as sources of nutrient pollution to surface water. And again, I'll have her introduce herself, if that's okay.
Thanks, and thanks for sticking with us here and bearing with the technical difficulties. So I'm a professor in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Behavior at the University of Minnesota. My background is in ecosystem ecology. I study carbon and nutrient cycling and plant-soil interactions. So trees are getting a lot of attention in the stormwater community, but I think in a couple of different contexts that in some ways are a bit opposing. So I just wanted to touch on that briefly. There's a lot of interest in using trees as a part of green infrastructure to reduce stormwater volumes because trees can promote interception, evapotranspiration, and infiltration. But at the same time, trees can contribute nutrients to stormwater. And I think it's important to realize that even if increasing tree canopy cover reduces stormwater volume, that you can actually increase the concentrations of nutrients in stormwater and your total loading can increase. And so I'm going to be talking about how trees can increase nutrient loading. And I just want to point out that when you plant trees next to impervious surfaces, that trees take up nutrients from the soil, they invest those nutrients in their leaves and flowers and fruits and seeds. And in the fall, when leaves drop, the plant only reabsorbs about 50% of the nutrients in those leaves before they drop to the ground. And if those nutrients fall on impervious surfaces, there's nothing to prevent them from moving downstream unless they're removed from the street. And I also wanted to point out that we often think of leaves as the problem. Leaves falling into streets definitely is the major way that trees contribute nutrients to streets and stormwater. But leaves or trees also drop other nutrient-rich materials to streets. So in the spring, we see a lot of flowers. These are male flowers of Norway maples on the left, and some maple samaras or immature seeds on the right. And those can be also significant sources of nutrients to streets. So I'm going to start by talking about three different somewhat related studies that provide evidence that trees can be important sources of nutrient pollution to streets and stormwater. And then I'm going to end by talking more about potential solutions. So I'll start by talking about the Prior Lake street sweeping study. So this was a study that was done in partnership with the city of Prior Lake in Minnesota. And it was led by Ross Bittner, who was working for the city of Prior Lake at the time, and Larry Baker from the University of Minnesota. And I also want to highlight Paula Kalinowski, who is a graduate student who did a lot of work on the project, and Chris Byarski, who was the technician on the project. And the idea behind the Prior Lake study was to try to quantify directly through street sweeping how much nitrogen and phosphorus in solids could be removed from streets, and how that varied as a function of both sweeping frequency and also tree canopy cover. And the Prior Lake study was novel relative to prior studies of street sweeping, in that it included the entire snow-free period. So a lot of past studies actually excluded the autumn period, when we see the majority of litter fall. We also quantified removal of nutrients and solids in the coarse material, or the litter itself, which had been excluded in a lot of past studies. As I mentioned, we quantified the solids and nutrients in the sweepings themselves, and we estimated cost effectiveness of street sweeping for phosphorus removal. The design was a multi-factor design where, as I mentioned, we were looking at both how much material we could remove from streets as a function of canopy cover, and also as a function of sweeping frequency. So we had 9 study routes that varied from low to high canopy cover, and then we swept either once, twice, or 4 times per month. And as I mentioned, we did this during the entire snow-free period for 2 years. So we ended up with quite a number of samples over the course of the study. The way that this was done with a regenerative air sweeper. And what we did was basically determine the entire mass of the sweeping load after each route was swept. Then we took subsamples of that and analyzed those subsamples for moisture content, and then we did a fractionation procedure where we could separate out the coarse organic material from the finer and soluble organic material. And then we analyzed everything for phosphorus, nitrogen, carbon, organic matter content, and total mass. So there were a couple things that we learned in this study. One was that the coarse organic fraction, which is basically litter fall, was a high fraction of the total dry solids and the total phosphorus and nitrogen, and that there was a seasonal pattern to this that corresponded to the changes in the activity of trees, and especially to litter fall. So this graph shows the contribution of coarse organics as a percent of the total sweeper load for dry solids in the blue, phosphorus in the green, and nitrogen in the orange. And you can see that over this 2-year period, there were distinct peaks in the fall, especially for phosphorus and nitrogen, although we also see some higher contributions of coarse organics to total phosphorus in the early part of the summer as well. We also saw effect of canopy cover. So we saw 10-fold more material coming into streets in high canopy streets compared to low canopy streets. So here I'm just showing 2 examples of 2 different routes. One that had a canopy cover of just 0.5% over of the street was covered by trees, and then a higher route where we had about 20% of the street was covered by trees. And this is just showing pounds per curb mile that was recovered by sweeping. And you can see, and I've divided into the soil phosphorus, which is essentially the fine fraction, and then the coarse material, which is the litter phosphorus. And you can see that we have much higher recovery in these high canopy streets, especially for the litter phosphorus. So the Prior Lake study then showed us that higher frequency of sweeping, which I didn't show you, and higher tree canopy cover lead to more recovery of phosphorus by the sweeper. And we also see that litter fall is an important component of the sweeper load, especially in the fall. But then this sort of begs the question of, how do litter fall nutrient inputs to streets compare to stormwater runoff nutrient yield? So what fraction of the stormwater runoff is actually coming from litter fall nutrients. And so to get at this, we used our prior lake data and we developed a statistical model that we then compared to runoff. And to do this, we actually used data that's been collected by the Capital Region Watershed District because they had annual loading for of nutrients in runoff for a number of subwatersheds of the Mississippi. These are largely in St. Paul and the northern adjacent suburbs. So this just shows the location of these watersheds where Cap Region's been monitoring annual nutrient loading. Each of the red dots represents one of their monitoring stations. And so what we did was we took our high frequency street sweeping information, so where we were sweeping 4 times per month, assuming that we're capturing most of the litter fall in those sweepings, that not a lot of the litter fall is being lost to the storm drain in between sweeping events. And we developed a relationship between what we measured in the street, so litter fall, phosphorus, nitrogen, and solids, and tree canopy cover across our different sweeping routes. And then we mapped that onto a high-resolution tree canopy cover map that was produced at the University of Minnesota for the Capital Region watershed, sub-watersheds, where they have annual loading data. And then we could compare our estimates of litter fall into the street with annual nutrient export from these subwatersheds. And this was done in partnership, obviously, with Capital Region Watershed District and with Jacques Finlay, my collaborator at the University of Minnesota, and Ben Janke, who's a postdoc working with us. So this figure shows fractional canopy cover over the street. So this is the proportion of the street that's covered by tree canopy. Each of the symbols represents one of these sub-watersheds. And then I've plotted either the annual litter fall inputs to the streets as estimated from the relationships that we determined in Prior Lake in green, or annual runoff phosphorus as measured in these different watersheds in blue. And the variability around the line is related to street density, so that's the other factor that's important here. But the main point that I want to emphasize is that we're estimating that somewhere between 37 and 64% of the runoff P in these watersheds is coming from litter fall into the streets. And I should mention that in this particular analysis, I accounted for what's removed during the twice yearly street sweeping that's done in these sub-watersheds. So we think that a substantial fraction of the runoff P is originating from litter fall. So I just want to talk about another study that lends further support to the importance of trees as sources of phosphorus, the stormwater. So this was a study that Ben led where we compiled we compiled data on stormwater quality from a number of different sources, and so we were really pleased to be able to obtain so much monitoring data across a number of different watershed management organizations, watershed districts, and we have data from Minneapolis Parks and Rec as well. So we were able to put all of these data together with information on tree canopy cover that has been measured from remote sensing by the University of Minnesota remote sensing lab. So we could look for relationships between stormwater nutrient concentrations and loading and tree canopy cover across a number of watersheds. And so this shows data from 16 different watersheds across the Twin Cities metro, where we're looking again at fractional tree canopy cover over streets, and then the concentrations of phosphorus and in blue and nitrogen in green in stormwater. And you can see that there is a significant positive relationship between tree canopy cover and phosphorus and nitrogen concentrations in stormwater. So, but we were also interested in the relationship between tree canopy cover and and total phosphorus export from these watersheds. And so in order to get loading or phosphorus yields from these watersheds, we also have to account for runoff volumes. And as I mentioned at the very beginning of the talk, we know that we can see declines in runoff volume as we increase tree canopy cover. So Ben did an analysis where he combined information on runoff volume with information on stormwater phosphorus concentrations to estimate phosphorus loads or phosphorus yields from these watersheds. And what we found was that there's, in addition to an effect of tree canopy, we also see an important role for street density. So as street density increases, we see an increase in phosphorus export from these watersheds, but we see the greatest export in from streets that have high canopy cover. And this is true at all of the street densities higher than 10 kilometers per square kilometer. So it's what this tells us is that the increase in concentration of stormwater phosphorus caused by having higher tree canopy more than offsets the runoff reduction, volume reduction, except at very low street densities. So then I just want to zoom in and look at one highly residential subwatershed that CAP region monitors. This is the Arlington Hamlin underground facility, and look at what we see at stormwater phosphorus concentrations over the season. So this shows stormwater phosphorus concentrations basically over the entire year. So this was a situation where we were able to get high resolution data over the entire year. And you can see that there's a big peak in stormwater phosphorus concentration in the fall that corresponds with the time when autumn litter fall happens. We also see another peak at leaf out, and this is when we see a lot of flowers and seeds and the little bud bracts that enclose the buds over the winter, falling into the street. And then we see an additional peak at snowmelt. And the snowmelt peak could either be a result of leaching of material that didn't get swept the previous fall, or runoff over frozen soils, or phosphorus that's accumulated in the snowpack. It's probably a combination of all three. All right, so then the final study that I want to mention is not a study that we've been involved with at all. This was a study that Bill Selbig did in Madison, Wisconsin. Bill is at the USGS in Middleton, Wisconsin. And he did a paired catchment study in Madison where he had very small residential catchments. And he was able to measure the runoff from these catchments. And he had control catchments that were not swept at all, and then test catchments where they did very thorough sort of best case scenario sweeping, where they did weekly sweeping and leaf removal during the warm season, the snow-free season. And these catchments were matched in terms of the canopy cover over the streets, which was about 17%. So this figure shows the mean monthly concentrations of total phosphorus in runoff. And he had a calibration period where prior to imposing the street sweeping treatment, and that's represented by the solid lines. So the main point there is that if you look at the blue solid line and the red solid line, these catchments seem to be pretty well matched in terms of phosphorus concentrations in runoff. Then during the treatment period, which is represented by the dashed lines, you can see that the treatment greatly reduced phosphorus concentrations compared to the control. And this figure actually shows phosphorus yields and in the control and treated catchment, and you can see that there's a great reduction in phosphorus yields, and it's particularly because of the reduction that you get in the fall in this treated catchment. So taken together, I think all of these studies suggest that tree litter fall is an important source of nutrients to stormwater. And so what I wanted to talk about for the remainder of my time is solutions. And I want to talk about solutions at the municipal scale, at the neighborhood scale, and at the scale of individual households or residents. So at the municipal scale, our Prior Lake study suggests that enhanced street sweeping that is targeted in high canopy neighborhoods and during the times of year that where litter fall is the greatest, so particularly the autumn, can be very cost effective in reducing phosphorus loading of stormwater. So as part of the Prior Lake study, Paula developed a street sweeping calculator tool. And this is a spreadsheet calculator that enables the user to estimate the cost and amount of solids and nutrients removed under different street sweeping scenarios. So as part of the Prior Lake study, we kept careful records of how much fuel it took to run the routes, how much labor was involved, how much depreciation occurred on the equipment, and so we could estimate the costs of different of street sweeping. So the questions that then can be asked with the calculator tool are how much solids and phosphorus can I remove for a given budget, or what is the lowest cost to achieve a particular removal goal. So this is just a screenshot of the calculator, and basically the user defines a route, puts in information about the curb miles on the route, that canopy cover, and we have default costs per curb mile that can be used, or the user can define those costs. And basically then the user can say, okay, what will I get if I sweep at a particular frequency during a particular month, and put together a street sweeping program and just get an idea of how much phosphorus could be removed, as well as solids and nitrogen, and how much might that cost. And so here's an example of output that you could get from different scenarios. So the different rows represent just sort of random scenarios where the user has said, I'm going to sweep, once in March and once in October, for instance, with scenario 1, or twice in March, twice in April, once in May, 3 times in October, 2 times in November for scenario 11. And then you can get information on the amount of phosphorus removed and the cost, total cost, and then the cost efficiency in terms of dollars per pound of phosphorus removed. And so if we want to know, for instance, what is the lowest cost to remove 35 pounds of phosphorus per year, the answer would be scenario 10. It would be $2,880. Or if we want to know what is the most phosphorus that can be removed for a given budget, say $2,000, then the answer would be, about 25 pounds, scenario 6. So these are just examples of how the street sweeping calculator tool can be used. And the calculator can be accessed from the Stormwater manual. So this is just a screenshot of the page on street sweeping for trees, and there's a link on the right side where you can get to another page that then has information about the calculator tool, and you can download the spreadsheet as well as the user guide. So of course, this information is specific to the conditions that we experienced in Prior Lake. So the kind of sweeper, obviously, the weather conditions that influence the moisture content, for instance, and the tree canopy conditions, and the species composition. But I did want to, oh, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. I just wanted to, this is important, I just wanted to point out that this is the kind of information that we learned from the Prior Lake study. That if we look at the cost efficiency in terms of dollars per pound of phosphorus removed, and compare, say, a low canopy route to a high canopy route, you can see that sweeping in a high canopy neighborhood during the fall is a really cost-effective way of removing phosphorus. So we're talking about less than $100 per pound of phosphorus, and if you compare that to the numbers that Joe was showing previously for a number of BMPs, it's orders of magnitude cheaper. And it also reduces then the downstream maintenance costs and things for other BMPs that both Andy and Joe were talking about. So I just want to say that in terms of, sort of moving to a way to credit street sweeping as a way of recovering phosphorus, one way that we think holds some promise is that if we use a subset of the data to predict the remaining data in the prior lake study, and we look at how well we can estimate recovered phosphorus from either curb miles swept or the fresh load weight or the dry load weight, we find that we can actually do a really good job of predicting the measured phosphorus that's recovered from the dry load weight. And so something that maybe holds promise in terms of developing a way to credit phosphorus recovery for street sweeping would be, if cities are able to at least keep track of the mass of material that they remove in street sweeping, if they know something about the moisture content of that, they can probably get an accurate picture of how much phosphorus is being removed through street sweeping. And I also just want to point out that for the watersheds that these CAP region watersheds that we've been working with, I estimated how much the typical twice per year sweeping in those watersheds removes of the litter fall phosphorus inputs to streets, and it's only about 8%. So I think there's a lot of potential here to really increase the amount of phosphorus that's being kept out of downstream surface waters, downstream BMPs using enhanced street sweeping. But of course, there are challenges with street sweeping, so I just wanted to touch on some of those, and a couple of them are depicted in this picture. So you can see that obviously to sweep streets, you have to restrict parking, and that can be a nuisance for residents. Also, in this picture, you can see that the sweepers are going through at a time when about half the leaves are still remaining in the trees and have yet to drop. So we did a little citizen science project with residents in one of the neighborhoods in St. Paul, and had residents keep track of tree phenology, so the timing of biological events over the season, including litter fall. And they entered those data into the Minnesota Phenology Network. And so then we were able to get information on when different common street trees are dropping their leaves. And so each of the green bars in this figure shows the period over which these different species dropped their leaves in this particular year. This is 2013. And then the sort of dashed window shows when this particular neighborhood was swept, and these neighborhoods are only swept once in the fall. And then the gold bar shows when St. Paul was sweeping the entire city. And so the main thing that I want you to notice here is that in this particular neighborhood, in this year, a lot of the trees had dropped all their leaves a considerable time before the street sweeping occurred. And so if, that means that those leaves were in the street, being driven over, fragmented, and there's opportunities for those leaves to be washed down the drain before they were swept up. On the other hand, there were neighborhoods in St. Paul that were swept before the majority of the leaves dropped for a number of these species. So it's really hard for a big city like St. Paul or Minneapolis to hit the timing right so that they're actually sweeping when the majority of the leaves are in the street. So that's another challenge. So just to summarize the sort of pros and cons of enhanced street sweeping, the pros are that it can be very cost effective if targeted appropriately to high canopy neighborhoods and to the right time of year. It not only reduces, phosphorus loading downstream, but it also reduces solids loading, and that can mean that there are reduced maintenance needs for any downstream BMPs. The cons are that it's hard to time. And we know that, the timing of leaf fall changes from year to year depending on the weather. Obviously, it requires capital investment in sweeping material, and it can be inconvenient for residents. So I just wanted to touch really briefly on neighborhood coordinated leaf removal efforts. So this is a more decentralized way of managing litter fall in streets, and I want to highlight an example of this. This is the Como Active Citizen Network, which was organized by Janet Haywood in collaboration with Lindsay Schwantes and Jessica Brommelkamp from Capital Region Watershed District, where basically they have organized neighbors to come together to augment the city's street sweeping program. And they just produced a report, and I've included a link at the bottom here where you can access this report, but I wanted to summarize some of the lessons that they've learned from this effort. One is that at the beginning, they had really centralized management where they were basically saying, okay, on this day, we're gonna all sweep and we're gonna pick up your leaves at these particular places and we're gonna provide you with, materials that you can set up composting bins on your property. And that, as the network grew, that just proved to be really unsustainable. And also it meant that it was less nimble in terms of allowing residents to time their pickup efforts to when the leaf drop was actually happening on their streets. So they've shifted now from a top-down management style to more of a network organizing. So they're really letting the residents basically take care of all of the timing and the disposal of leaves and that sort of thing. They also learned that it was much more effective to shift from sort of a we are educating you mode of engaging residents to inviting residents to participate. So I think the pros and cons of this neighborhood coordinated leaf removal is the pros are that it, again, is cost effective because it's totally volunteer based. It's very nimble in that it's possible to target the streets when the leaves are actually coming down. It engages citizens around water quality issues, but on the con side, it's difficult to control whether, where, and when it happens. There's a danger of having participant fatigue. It's also unclear how scalable this is, and I know that's something that Jana is interested in trying to figure out. And then finally, I wanted to mention individual adopt-a-drain programs. So there's been a lot of encouragement of individuals to adopt a drain. So basically to choose a drain that's close by to their home and keep that drain clear of debris. So I wanted to just talk about some of the pros and cons of these individual efforts. On the pro side, again, it's cost effective and nimble and engages citizens the same way that the neighborhood efforts do. On the con side, again, it's very hard to control whether, when, and where this happens. It's also hard to assure quality. One of the things that I think residents probably don't understand is that not only is it important to clean out the drain, but all of the curb upstream of that drain has to be kept clear as well, or during a heavy rain event, all of that material is going to wash into the drain. Again, there's a danger of participant fatigue, and again, we don't know how scalable this is. So I wanted to just highlight what I see as some of the research needs. I think we really have to understand, there's a lot of potential for enhanced street sweeping to reduce phosphorus loading of stormwater, but obviously municipalities, or at least some municipalities are sweeping much more frequently than others. And so I think we need to understand what are the barriers to enhanced street sweeping. Why aren't more cities sweeping more? And what are the most important barriers? I think we need to develop mechanisms for crediting phosphorus removal through street sweeping and do comparisons of the cost effectiveness of street sweeping versus downstream BMP maintenance. I think that we need to extend what we did in Prior Lake to neighborhoods with higher tree canopy cover. The Prior Lake neighborhoods had a maximum tree cover of 20%, and we have a lot higher canopy cover neighborhoods around our metro area. And then I think we need to better understand the effectiveness and scalability of these neighborhood and individual efforts. So in conclusion, I think enhanced street sweeping can be effective as a tool for improving water quality, but it has to be implemented appropriately, and that means targeting high canopy neighborhoods and targeting autumn leaf drop and spring leaf drop, or spring litter fall. And neighborhood and individual efforts hold some promise, but we have to figure out how they can be sustained and how they can be implemented at scale.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, good information. I'm going to check here and see what questions. Like I said, we are behind schedule, and so we are going to go a few minutes here yet over, if that's okay with everybody here.
I have a question while you're
yes.
looking for the questions here. Can you talk about the different types of street sweepers and which work better than others?
Yeah, so I am not an engineer. I'm an ecologist, so I'll put that in. Andy might be able to answer this better than I. But they're mechanical sweepers or regenerative air sweepers, and they definitely differ in their effectiveness. So these regenerative air sweepers are more effective than the mechanical sweepers. And there have been studies comparing them. I don't have the numbers in my head, but it does matter what kind of sweeper. And then, other cities are doing completely different practices, right? Where they're actually, like sucking, like they'll have residents put all the leaves on the boulevard, and then they'll basically vacuum those leaves up. I don't know if you want to add anything. Yeah. So yeah, there are differences. Thank you.
Have any communities that do dedicated leaf pickup versus regular sweeping been considered? I'm not sure what that means by considered. But maybe this question is alluding to this question I kind of had as a follow-up to yours is, are you familiar with work that maybe, because I think some cities have tried to implement leaf pickup programs. Is that correct? And do you know if those have been effective or not?
Yeah, I don't know of studies that have determined the downstream consequences of those efforts. But there is a huge variation in how cities are managing their leaf pickup. And I know that some cities have actually quite frequent pickup, and they do leaf removal in this method where they're, basically having residents collect all their leaves, and then they come along and remove those, as opposed to just getting what's, falling in the street. I don't know of studies that have been compared those different practices in terms of the downstream water quality benefits. Good question.
Just a note here, East Lansing does leaf pickup, like you just mentioned. Here's a question. Are communities coordinating their water system and hydrant flushing process with their fall leaf program? Each fall we find lots of leaves are washed down the drains due to the difficulty of coordinating these two activities. I don't know if you're familiar with any of that. And cities flush their hydrants?
Oh, yeah. I don't think there's coordination.
Okay, so then that could certainly be problematic, I would assume.
Yeah. Although it does seem like a lot of the flushing happens in summer when the leaf fall is the lowest, actually. And that would be a good time of year to do it.
Well, that's certainly a good point. I think that cities should keep that in mind. But, have staff hours been considered in the cost of sweeping?
Yeah.
Okay, yes, they have. Have there been studies done comparing the negative impacts of operating equipment for sweeping versus carbon emissions versus the benefit of phosphorus removal?
Yeah, and that's certainly a trade-off. And I don't know of any, that would be fairly easy to estimate, actually, from the fuel use, because we have information on that, but we haven't done that explicitly.
Here's a very big picture question that I don't expect folks to answer, but I think it's a good question that maybe we at PCA should consider, which is what does the city, well, you're more than welcome to jump in too. What does the stormwater city of the future look like, and how do we take all these ideas to scale in a cost-effective way? And one thing I would point out is that I think one of the reasons I invited these three speakers was that pollution prevention, I think, is extremely important because it really helps our downstream structural BMPs perform better, and you alluded to that too. So if we're overloading these structural BMPs with phosphorus, they're not going to last as long as we had hoped. So, any thoughts on that point? I'm retiring in 5 years, so I won't.
The year 2030,
I won't
what
be
will
seeing
you be doing differently? We'll have to get back to you on that one, whoever asked that question.
But I mean, I do think that what we want to move towards is some kind of where we want to close the phosphorus cycle, because right now, basically, our trees are acting as pumps. They're moving soil phosphorus into the street. That's ending up where we don't want it in our water bodies. And if there's a way to capture that phosphorus and get it back on the landscape where it's needed in a sustainable way, which maybe means using, an electrified fleet of sweepers. I mean, those are the kinds of things that I think about as in the future.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I have heard it mentioned once or twice that, we're wasting phosphorus, really, is what it comes down to, which is a valuable resource. So has your P-loading model been tested for transferability? In other words, the bifold cross-validation worked well in your study, but have you tested it in other areas with other tree characteristics, species densities?
No, and that's an important question around this crediting issue. So that would be a great next step. Yeah.
And one question that I had, or maybe it's more of a comment, I'm not sure, but you mentioned that neighborhood centralized approach is not sustainable, and that makes sense to me. But it seems like that is maybe a good way to at least get the neighbors to start thinking about the issue, and so that might be the impetus to get them to do the more individual things. I don't know.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think that's what I meant by it engages citizens around issues of water quality and gets them to start thinking about water quality issues and potentially take more agency over efforts to keep litter fall out of streets. And I think that's an important research need is what are the best ways to engage citizens around these issues.
Any urban forestry comprehensive planning guidelines that you're familiar with to minimize P-loading? Maybe that's a question more for urban forestry folks.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we found, I didn't talk about this research today, but we actually compared phosphorus loading in different streets that have different tree species as the dominant street tree. And I think that it's actually the size of the tree and how much litter is coming into the street that's more important than, say, the phosphorus concentration. That seems to vary less. It doesn't vary that much from species to species, but if you have more tree canopy cover, that's going to be the factor that's going to, increase your total phosphorus loading and litter.
And it kind of struck me when I was thinking when you were talking about the different tree species and how they drop. Here we have the emerald ash problem because we've planted a monoculture in some areas. So the solution to that is to plant multiple species, but now you've got multiple species dropping leaves at different times.
That's exactly right. And I think that, and that's something that we have thought a lot about is that, as urban foresters are diversifying the canopy in order to make the canopy more disease resistant and pest resistant, then that complicates things for street sweeping because it means that you may have different timing of litter fall. So, maybe the next step in terms of planning the tree canopy cover of the future is to try to at least plant species together that drop their leaves at the same time, even if they're different species.
And I'm wondering, you mentioned phenology too, but I wonder if maybe some GIS mapping might be a useful tool to know that you have certain species in a certain area of the city and you sweep here versus.
Yeah, and we actually tried to. So there's a network of something called phenocams, which are basically webcams that allow you to track phenology remotely, and we set one of those up in the city, but not at large scale. So I think the use of remote sensing, for instance, to track the timing of litter fall is a great way to collect a lot of data on phenology.
Did you want to wrap up, Tim?
Yeah. So, I just
come back here and wrap up real quick.
I just wanted to thank the speakers. Just a wealth of information, and I think we're really lucky in this state to have such great speakers who can talk about this important issue. So with that, again, thank you so much for your patience in getting through our technical difficulties. And just to kind of reiterate, I wanted to mention, as I said earlier at the beginning of the webinar, that sorry about that, that there are professional development hours available and the certificate will be posted in the Stormwater manual. And what I'll do after the webinar is over, probably tomorrow, is I'll send an email to everyone who's registered, and I will give them the link to the recorded webinar, and also we'll get the Q&A up there as soon as possible. We'll go through all the comments or the questions that we received and try and provide the answers as soon as we can. So some other links in the manual that are related to today's presentation: wet ponds, biofiltration, there's information on trees, street sweeping, the calculator is in there, yard waste management, and phosphorus and stormwater lakes, and media and amendments to Attenuate P. So we are looking to have another live webinar in the spring. We're looking at a webinar on constraints to infiltrating stormwater. And we really would like to we'd really like it if you would let us know what topics you are most interested in for future webinars. We have been doing several recorded webinars, and again, those are available for your viewing in the Stormwater Manual on the webinar page. We're doing more and more of these, so we'd love to hear feedback from all of you. So with that, that concludes the webinar for today, and thank you so much for your patience with us, and we hope that we'll have you on another webinar in the near future. Thank you.